Okay, I want to start with something very, very simple. There we go. That technology works. That's good. Just to remember that, these trade agreements and international trade are really, really important in Canada. We always sort of talk about all these other countries like China and so forth who are big traders and so forth. But in terms of the proportion of their GDP, it's less than Canada. This is really important for us, right? And it's even more important when we come to our agri-food trade and agri-food exports. And, to do this well, we need secure market access. And however good or bad they are, that's only going to come from trade agreements, right? Without them, the risks are really, really large. So, we do need the trade agreements. And expand, and given that, the Canadian population is growing very slowly and at least some of us are overweight, probably the Canadian market isn't going to grow hugely in the near future. So if we're going to grow or have this industry expand, we're going to need to go, to be doing a lot more selling abroad. So I want to talk a little bit of what I call the Canadian trade landscape, which is a sort of, network of all of these trade agreements that we belong to that sort of, set the stage or the landscape for how we can conduct trade in Canada. So, of course, bottom line, we are a member of the WTO, and now most countries in the world belong, 162 countries. There are still a few countries outside, but, and where there are then no rules, right? So, but, and the WTO provides a reasonable basic set of rules for how trade can be conducted. And what that means is that firms that are engaged in international trade have some idea of when a foreign government could intervene and sort of shut their market off or market access off or something, and when they can be assured that tariffs aren't going to go up or something, right? But, almost everybody has the WTO, so what you'd really like is to be better than WTO. Better market access, better rules, stronger rules, tariffs don't go up, something like that. Well, of course, the agreement that we still have now, the major agreement we still have now, is NAFTA. And, that started with the Canada-U.S. trade agreement back in '88, followed by adding Mexico in 1994. That gave us better than WTO access to, a very large market and a very large population. And just below there, you can see that's the size of the Canadian, roughly the current size of the Canadian market and population and so forth. So this gave us better than WTO. NAFTA gave us better than WTO access to a market that's about more than 10 times as large as our domestic market. So that's pretty good. And by the way, the numbers in red, those numbers there are today, not when we signed the agreement, but what the size of those markets are today, because I want to do some comparisons in a minute. So this is not back in 1994 or something. This is now, right? Just for comparison's sake. So what's happened since then? Well, these are the agreements that Canada has managed to sign since NAFTA in 1994, roughly 20 years. So we've had NAFTA, and now we have 20 years of other agreements. Well, as you could see, they're not exactly huge. You add them all up, they're 13% of what we got in NAFTA in terms of the value of the market access. Better market access, better than WTO we got, and only 30% of the NAFTA population. So for 20 years, we haven't done much. We haven't really done very much. But what's happening now? There's a huge change going on. We're, pretty far down the road with 4 new agreements. The Canada-South Korea agreement, the Canada-EU agreement, the CETA, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And by the way, the number there for the Trans-Pacific Partnership takes out the numbers for U.S., Mexico, Chile, and Peru, where we already have trade agreements, so you wouldn't be double counting. That's just the extra that would come from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, not counting the ones we already have agreements with. And we're fairly, at least we're in serious and negotiations with India. You add that all up, and we have a huge potential sea and change, right? 1.5 times what we got in NAFTA in terms of better market access, and 5 times the NAFTA population. So this is a big deal, right? For the first time in 20 years, there is the potential in the near future for our trade landscape to change considerably. And NAFTA was transformative for the Canadian economy, and maybe this will be too. So if all these agreements come, into fore, there's a huge potential. But of course, the outcome will depend on what we would call the ambition of the agreement. But just because you have an agreement doesn't mean it's going to give you an awful lot, or it could give you a lot. NAFTA gave us quite a lot, I think. And of course, even if you provide opportunities, it really depends on then how the private sector in Canada reacts, in terms of seizing new export opportunities that arise from other trade barriers coming down, and of course there will be new competitors as we have to take down some of our barriers. Right. So it's going to be a new, it's never a slam dunk. You still have to see what's going to how the firms and so forth will react. Why haven't there been, so why did nothing happen for 20 years? Well, negotiators like Joe are scarce. They're not interchangeable pegs or something. So countries prioritize. And to be honest, 35 million people, we're just not very interesting. We're not really that big. We're rich, but we're not really that interesting. So we were the priority. The EU was out there negotiating with Mercosur and with India and with South Korea and so forth. Compared to us, they're pretty big fish. So, Eventually, of course, the EU works its way through, most countries. It actually has agreements with most countries, and eventually you sort of get to Canada, and we begin to negotiate there, and we're interested, of course. We had to almost beg to join, or we did have to beg to join the TPP. Initially, the Americans and New Zealanders and the Australians and so forth, who were already negotiating, said, nah, we don't even want you there. Mm-hmm. So, and one of the things we obviously had to do was to put where we don't like to negotiate on supply management, we had to actually put that on the table. And then some of these other agreements, well, finally, as Joe was saying, people woke up that Doha wasn't going anywhere, and maybe we should start to work on other regionals like India and South Korea and so forth. They were interested in us. But of course, all the other agreements we signed over the years, the 20 years, we were the big fish for Israel and for Costa Rica and for Panama and so forth. So, that was a little word on Doha, and I think Joe covered most of it, is that, there's been no real success and no likelihood of success. So that's why we have all of these, interest in big regional trade agreements. And of course, one of the big stumbling blocks at Doha has been agriculture. And you could sort of find ways to keep agriculture at least partially out of some of these, at least, somewhat out of these regional trade agreements. And they're not supposed to be. Everything's supposed to be in. But the other thing to say about, people sort of complain and nothing's happened since Doha. But in actual fact, the WTO has not been inactive. 50 countries have joined. 50 countries, including China and Russia, have joined. And now we have at least that much assurance of getting into those markets. So it's not been totally inactive, since the last round of Uruguay. Why is it so quiet, though? I mean, we have all these, we're in the midst of something that could radically change our trade landscape. It's just really quiet. I know most of you weren't here when NAFTA was being negotiated. I was, and it was a huge debate in this country. And same thing. I mean, all you have to do is, every time there's or at least most every time there's a WTO minister, there's ministerial people protesting in the street and dressed up as bananas and dolphins and all of that stuff. NAFTA and WTO, however, people know what's going on, right? They're very transparent. Joe could talk about the texts and what they're arguing about. But the current negotiations have all been conducted with a great deal of secrecy. There's some consultation, yes, with briefings of industry that are sort of narrow to the industry, but not the wider things. So there's been virtually no public debate about these things. And like I said, the four of them at least are bigger than NAFTA in terms of what could happen. So they're just sort of presented as done deals, and there's sort of no debate. And of course, because nobody knows what's in them until the day they're sort of done, they're open to a lot of spin, because whoever's inside can spin it the way they want, but, there's no real analysis, I don't think. So I think the secret negotiations have meant there's been little opportunity for debate, and also means there's been very little analysis, because if you don't know what's in the agreement, you can't spend an awful lot of time trying to figure out what might be happening. And I actually honestly challenge you, when you go home tonight or, get on your phone or whatever right now, see if you can actually find some analysis of, say, the Canada EU agreement or the TPP. It simply isn't there. So we're sort of flying blind, and that bothers me a lot. Why are they negotiations secret? Well, you might like to sort of blame the Canadian government, but no, secrecy is just the way the EU operates, and the TPP was already secret before Canada got to join. So but having said that, not having protesters in the street, not having huge debate is good for negotiators and good for the government that's negotiating them. Right? So there's some motive there. Okay. What's happening? Okay, so what's in these agreements? At least, and I'm not going to go through line by line or anything, but we can talk a little bit about what's in these agreements. So we have the Canada-South Korea agreement, was signed in 2014. It's not ratified yet, so it hasn't come into force, but we do know what's in it. The text is available, and so what's the level of ambition? Well, one of the things was the U.S. was also negotiating with South Korea, and at least for Canadian agriculture and for a lot of products, I think it was important for Canada not to fall behind. The U.S. was going to have an agreement, and if they got the concessions, we really wanted to be there because we didn't want to fall behind. Basically, there's going to be considerable duty-free access to both markets, but a long phase-in, 10-year phase-in, phase-down for many products. For agriculture, first thing and foremost, there's no liberalization for Canadian supply management sectors. We didn't give anything, as far as I could see, in the Korean agreement. We were very interested in getting into the Korean market for beef. There's a very, very long phase down, however. So, we'll get it, but in the long run. More important, the Koreans have built in a lot of safeguards. That means if we have a big export success, if we start to export an awful lot of beef or something to Korea, they can put the tariffs back up. Right, so the market access is not super secure. And just in case, because everybody's sort of got these little sensitive things, if you were thinking of investing in Korean rice production or investing in beef farming in Korea, forget it. We don't have that. I know you were all ready with your checkbooks. The bigger one, I guess, and the one I'm going to talk a little bit more, is the CETA, the Canada-EU agreement. Took 5 years to negotiate. Was finished in September 2014. It's 500-odd pages long, and if you ever wonder what people in Saskatchewan do in the long winters, you'll now know, because I have read the damn thing, right? It's still not ratified, and it has to be ratified by the Canadian Parliament, the EU Council, the EU Parliament, and individual member states of the EU for some things. So it's not there yet. It's done, but it's not done. The photo op's been done, but it's still not happening. So in terms of agriculture, the CETA, I don't know if Steve Huell is here. I don't think he is. But he and I used to have sort of these go-rounds that he'd say, well, for CETA, everything's on the table. And I'd say, really? We have supply management. You're not really telling me you're putting this on the table. And, the EU has some things about biotechnology and beef produced using hormones and some markets for beef and pork and so forth. I don't think so. But, so there was at least some speculation that there was, on agriculture, sort of a grand bargain, basically, that Canada keeps supply management and EU retains its contentious SBS barriers. Right. So at least that was a speculation, and I think that actually sort of is what happened, right? I did call it a grand bargain. It's another presentation, and everybody said, you can't have this protectionist thing being a grand bargain, so it's a not-so-grand bargain, but a bargain no less. And, of course, there were some other special interests in the EU that sort of pertain to agriculture, market access for specialty cheeses, recognition of geographical indicators, and the pricing of wine. So, quickly to go through, this is a sort of list of things I'm going to talk about a little bit in terms of the CETA. direct things for agriculture and maybe some of the indirect things that apply to agriculture. So tariffs. What's happening to tariffs? Well, there are in the CETA there are 5 tariff schedules for how tariffs will be reduced or not. And basically, the only ones that are important for agriculture are A, immediate. As soon as the agreement comes into force, they'll come off. There's virtually nothing in agriculture and all the other ones except E, where there's no reduction. Almost all of the things where we have pretty good market access, where the tariffs are low now with the EU, they go to 0. So that's good, but it's not going to be a huge gains, I don't think. All of Canada's supply management products, the high above quota tariffs remain. They're on Schedule E. There is no change, no liberalization there at all. And both, very interesting, both the Canada and the EU, the within quota tariffs, that's for the stuff that comes in under the quota with low tariffs, are going to 0, which means no trade liberalization, but just means you transfer rents from the government to whoever owns the quota, which is kind of interesting. In terms of the TRQs, the things that are most constraining in agriculture, on the EU side, there's a TRQ quota on wheat that's going to expand quite a lot, from 39,000 tons to metric tons to 100,000. So that sounds nice, but given Canada's global exports, or the EU wheat production, I don't think anybody's going to notice a heck of a lot. There was a funny thing about bison. The EU doesn't have a separate tariff line for bison, and there does appear to be a reasonable market for bison in the EU. But because they don't have a tariff line for bison meat gets lumped in with beef. And so now that's been hived off just for bison, but it's still under beef, and beef has, large tariffs and so forth. So there's a little bit of within quota tariff going to bison. I don't know why we just didn't ask the EU to create a separate tariff line for bison, because I think that market could grow. Now it's constrained in the future. And for beef, yeah, we got a fair chunk of increase in the sort of within quota, or the quota for beef, but there's riders on that. One is that it has to be produced without growth hormones, and we produce almost all the beef in Canada with growth hormones, which, now maybe there's enough quota for people in the beef industry to think, well, I'm going to, eschew using beef hormones and so forth. But there's still a little bit of a problem. If you look deep in the agreement, is the allocation of that quota is going to be done annually by the EU. So it's going to say who's going to be allowed to import annually. But if you're going to produce beef without hormones, you have to make that production decision longer than a year ago, longer before than when the animal is going to go to slaughter. So you're not going to know whether you have secure access to the EU market, right? Because you're going to have a dedicated supply chain to keep that all separate. So we don't know. It's not come into play, but there could be a problem there. Pork, yeah, there seems to be, we may have gained something in pork. Mm-hmm. On our side, supply management, the only thing where anything really changed was the Europeans were interested in specialty cheeses, and there is a considerable. We're giving a considerable increase in the quota of specialty cheeses, but in the end, it's still only about 7% of the total Canadian consumption with the increase. So I don't think it really threatens supply management, and it's only one small chunk of the market, right? And it's not even sure that whether these specialty cheeses coming in from Europe are actually really compete with what we like to produce, things like cheddar and so forth. I think they're different products. I don't think there's going to be a market displacement, a total market displacement anyway. No mention at all of anything else in supply management in the CETA, only specialty cheeses. There is also Canada, not the EU, has a special safeguard on that we can apply if imports come in at great rates, even over those the very high over quota tariffs. So even if somebody could actually successfully export with the over quota tariffs, we could put up higher tariffs. as far as I can read the provisions. Right? So I think, you know, supply management is pretty largely protected, which is all right. Some other weird things. Rules of origin. In other words, stuff has to be, you know, the rules of origin, because we're in a free trade agreement with the Americans and so forth, there have to be rules of origin about how much of a product is Canadian so that it can qualify to get the benefits from the EU in terms of the lower tariffs and market access and so forth. Well, one of the very bizarre things, I think, is, and I don't know how we did this, the provision for qualifying for the lower tariffs into the EU is the animals have to be born and raised in Canada. That sounds like cool. Only on the other side, except we did it to ourselves, right? At least somehow we did this. So I mean, you know, and maybe, you know, at least my perception is that maybe the big slaughter plants in Western Canada aren't going to do too much of this. They might. I don't know. It's going to be dedicated lines or days of the week or something. But there are smaller slaughter plants in central Canada that might be more willing to do this, but that's where all the sort of back and forth of animals and meat and so forth is. So if nothing else, there's going to be a lot of paperwork to prove, you know, that you can actually qualify to get into the EU market, right? And then a whole bunch of other things, like just basic slaughtering and basic processing of crops and vegetables and so forth, just don't qualify, right? So in other words, we agreed that we had to do more than, say, just slaughtering meat and sending it off, right, to qualify. So that seems a little odd. Where Canada should have been really interested was the SPS rules. That's the stuff like beef produced using hormones and in biotechnology and all of those things. That's what's in the agreement. Blank. Nothing. We got nothing from the Europeans. Okay, so some of these more indirect things, the pricing of wine. One of the very long-run complaints of the European Union is that, you know, their wine is discriminated in through the provincial liquor boards, right? I mean, this is something the provinces have power over, and no, they're not tariffs, but they put huge markups on wine, and the Europeans certainly felt that, you know, that they were, you know, it varies by province to province, so it's hard to say, but they certainly felt that their wines were being discriminated. Their high-quality wines were paying very high commissions, taxes in the government liquor stores and so forth. So, you know, and provinces do this initially to discourage consumption, didn't want any sin, and now, you know, they found out it was worth a lot of money, so, you know. But Canadian wine consumption has been rising fast. So eventually, in the CETA, you know, the Canadian government had to get the provincial governments on side, but there's a number of provisions in the CETA to basically make the commissions or the taxes, provincial government taxes charged on liquor by the liquor boards to be flat taxes, so it doesn't go up with the quality, right? So in other words, it won't discriminate against supposedly high quality wine. And another just an interesting little thing in there that somebody was awake in the European side is that BC and Ontario actually have special wine shops that only sell wine from their provinces. Those are now capped because, you know, no EU wine was sold in those stores. Now, the stores are grandfathered, but there will be no new stores like that, right? Everything, you know, you have to sell EU wine as well as other people's wine, right? Or as well as Canadian wine. Another area was, you know, that EU was very big on was geographical indicators. You know, as the EU has had to reform some of its subsidy policies, one of the things it's been doing is then giving or encouraging farmers and groups of farmers to, you know, apply for a geographical indicator for their product, which basically gives them a monopoly on the product. And then what the EU has been actively doing in a whole bunch of its trade agreements is then saying, we want to get foreigners to recognize our geographical indicators so that they can extend the monopoly of their farmers into other markets. And they've done that in South Africa. They've done it in a number of other countries. So in the CETA, the EU made pretty clear that this is what they wanted to do. there's a little problem, different kind of laws. We protect those kinds of things with trademarks, and the EU uses and U.S. uses trademarks, and the EU uses geographical indicators. So that's a little bit of a problem, but I don't think that's the major problem. The bigger problem is what are known as generic products. In other words, Canadian firms produce feta cheese, call it feta cheese. There's no geographical connotation to that. It's just some kind of white cheese of a particular style, right? And we call it feta. Right? These were very, very difficult negotiations, and I think we ended up in what I would call a classic diplomatic compromise. So Canada agreed to recognize 175 EU geographical indicators, and a whole bunch of things: cheeses, processed meats, olive oil, beer, baked goods, spices, vinegar, a whole bunch of things, fruits, nuts. The compromise was that for those Canadian firms that actually produce this as generics now, for these particular products that are listed there, they are grandfathered. They can still use those labels. So, if you're producing Asiago cheese in Canada now, you could keep that after the CETA. But there will be no new firms allowed to do that, right? So that sort of closes that sort of market off in the future. One would sort of think maybe that, this might be important for cheese imports, but the TRQ is still there, and the special safeguard is still there. So, I don't think we're going to be awash with cheese and so forth, even with the geographical indicators. And by the way, it just means you can't use the geographical indicators. You can still produce Canadian feta cheese, you just can't call it that. You're going to have to call it something else. For instance, we have an agreement with the EU about wines and spirits. We already had, and we used to produce port in Canada. We can't anymore. So they sell it in liquor stores, at least in British Columbia. It's something called pipe or something. They changed the name, but it's still the same product. So it's not that. The other thing is we asked for nothing. We got nothing from the Europeans. The Canadian list is empty. We don't have anything worth protecting, I guess, right? Well, we don't actually. I shouldn't say that. We don't use the same method, right? There is an interesting provision in the CETA about anti-dumping, where there's a public interest clause, and this is fairly new, in the sense that if anti-dumping duties were going up and that was going to say impact consumers, you might be able to make an argument that that would be a bad thing for consumers, and maybe the anti-dumping duties should be a little bit lower or something. We don't know how that's going to work, but it is inventive, I guess, or different, right? Biotechnology. This was one of the things where Canada really had, I think, an interest in getting this sorted out with the EU. We're a major developer and exporter of agricultural biotechnology and its products, but it's a really difficult problem in the EU. And their regulatory system is in flux. Certainly Canadian exports suffer. Canadian GM canola doesn't get any market play there. We had a major problem with flax being shut out of the EU market, although a relatively minor crop. It's the big market. EU was the big market for Canadian flax. It's never come back. And of course, Richard Gray might argue with me, but it also probably has stifled the EU problem with GMs has stifled the development of GM wheat, because nobody wants to actually lose the EU market. So, basically all Canada wants is the EU to actually apply what it's agreed to in the WTO, which is a science-based system. But the EU just cannot live with that, right? So, what do we get? We get a classic, what I think is a classic compromise, where we set up a place to talk about biotech issues, but no closure. So we could talk, and we could talk, we could talk, and we could talk, and we could talk, and we could talk, and we could talk, but nothing happens, right? So I think that was a clear win for the EU. That's just my perception. Okay, what are we doing? So I think What's the summary in the CETA? Well, it's a big market in the EU, and yes, where tariffs were low, they're going to come off, so that will be a help to a range of Canadian agricultural industries. But supply management in Canada is protected, and the EU got to keep its SPS measures on things like biotech and beef produced using hormones and so forth. So I think where protection was before, there will be protection still, and liberalization elsewhere, right? And I think secret negotiations give you some of these interesting compromises. Maybe without secret negotiations, you wouldn't get it done at all, but you get some interesting things. Trans-Pacific Partnership, again, 12 countries. But remember, we already have free trade agreements with a number of those markets, the ones in blue, right? So, the real increases in market access are going to come for the other countries. Yeah. And we did have to put supply management on the table to be allowed to join the TPP negotiations. Agreement was reached on October 5th last year. So that should be 15, October 5th, 2015, just before the Canadian federal election. And the Liberal government has sort of said, well, we'll look at it. We're not sure we're going to ratify it. I think they probably will, but I don't know for sure. But the real ratification problem is what Joe was talking about. It just may not come to pass in the United States, and I think we just don't know. So, it's a wait and see to see if it actually happens. So, a lot of spin, a lot of good things, and it's true. We'll get, and Joe showed the slide of the tariffs coming down on beef. We are going to get better access to the Japanese beef market over time, but so will our TPP competitors, the U.S., New Zealand, and Australia. So while we'll get better access, it really will be up to the Canadian industry to be competitive with our competitors in that market, right? So it's not a slam dunk, I don't think. I think it could be done, but it's not a slam dunk, right? The two big markets are probably Vietnam and Malaysia. Well, we'll just have to see what will come out of that. I mean, we're not going to sell an awful lot more stuff to Australia or New Zealand and so forth. I mean, they produce what we produce, and we're not going to go greatly there. We had to give some concessions on supply management, but I think they're manageable increases in import quotas. The high above quota tariffs remain. I think given long phase-ins and increases in the quotas, and given there will be some domestic market growth, I don't think it really threatens supply management. They may not get all the benefits from the domestic market growth they thought they might have gotten, but we'll see. The only exception is, for some reason, the TRQ is actually going to be gone for whey powder, and that means that now 270% tariff is going to come off for a number of years, 11 years, right? But that's the only major getting rid of the trade barriers. It's huge. It's thousands of pages long. I saw one estimate that it's 16,000 pages long. Even long Saskatchewan winters have not got me there yet. And of course, as Joe alluded, there's certainly some interest, particularly whether China would join. I think that's maybe wishful thinking, but you never know. Certainly, I think it's going to take some time to actually have a look and actually do the analysis of the TPP, because as far as I could see, not much has been done. Real analysis. And finally, Canada, India. Again, it's been very secretive. There has been a leaked text for almost 2 years now, and it was hoped when the Modi government was elected in India that it would be more business friendly and maybe things would move along. But India's been really quite obnoxious at the WTO since then, so it's hard to say. We don't know whether this draft is real. The leaked draft, but it doesn't have huge ambition, it appears. India is still very protectionist about agriculture. Then the tariff reductions are going to have very long phase-ins. And EU's got the anti-surge protection. In other words, the being able to raise the tariffs again if we actually were to have a very large export success. So we'll have to see. And there doesn't seem to be anything in the secretive leaked agreement about supply management. So I guess we continue to protect that, and nothing too much to worry about anyway, I don't think. So the trade agreement set the landscape, but market forces will determine trade, right? I think Canada's trade landscape is relatively strong. The WTO has 162 members, 50-plus members since 1995, including India and China. So, that's good. We have NAFTA. We still have NAFTA, and now we have these these other agreements come along. South Korea too. I think we're getting a good set of rules. They're never perfect. But there's progress. They're never perfect. But what about the markets? To me, and I think Joe started his presentation by talking about the markets. I'm going to sort of end there a little bit. So what about market forces? Well, I think the elephant in the room is this. There will be 9.6 billion people to be fed by 2050. That's the elephant in the room. And we think, 2050 is like, Back to the Future's movies. That's a long way out in the future, right? Well, it's not so much far out in the future, particularly if you have to do things in infrastructure and so forth to be able to capitalize on and make investments to capitalize on this. And by the way, all of these projections that I have, that I'm going to show in a minute or two, are based on before China changed its policy. Now, China's changed its policy to get rid of 1 child per family, go to 2, right? Just think about what that could do to all of these projections, right? Over 35 years, 25 years from now, could be a lot more people in China just from that. And I would think if you go to 2, probably it will be eroded to, that policy may just go. So again, the projections are conservative because China has changed its policy, right? Market forces, 2.6 billion extra mouths to feed. That's a 35% increase in food demand just from people, right? And of course, many people are getting richer, and as one moves out of extreme poverty, the extra money is spent on food. And most of the population growth, or almost all of the population growth, will be in developing countries, where agriculture is already farmed unsustainably in many places, and climate change is going to make things worse for a number of those countries, for a number of those big markets. So there's going to be a lot more people, and they're going to struggle to increase their production. You sort of think that, who is getting rich or what's getting rich? Well, actually, the big boosts in food consumption come when people move from being very poor, $1.25 a day, to something like $3 or $4 a day. That's where the big gains in food consumption come. So it doesn't have to be that they're going to get as rich as us. It's just that they have to get out of the grinding poverty to have that's where, the extra income is spent on food. After $10 a day, it's still an increase in food, but not so much. Or not. And again, if you just look at the populations, and what proportion of populations live on less than $2 a day and so forth, they're very, very large in those countries. And they're getting richer. So a lot of these people are going to move out of that into that area where they begin to be able to buy lots more food. So what's the upshot of this? Well, combination of more people and people eating more probably means that food demand could double by 2050, right? And another very interesting statistic is that the number of people who are going to be relatively rich, in other words, earning more than $16,000 a year, is going to move from in developing countries, is going to move from 350 million roughly to 2.1 billion people. They're going to want to be buying an awful lot of more processed, value-added kinds of products. The other interesting thing is, there's this big increase in population, but there's urbanization going on. And in actual fact, almost all of the increase in world population is going to be in cities. We sort of think of, there's lots of peasants out there in third world countries or developing countries, that will be out there growing food, almost all of that increase in population is going to be urban. I mean, they're not the exact people, but it's going to be urban. They're going to be living here, and they're not going to be growing food. So where are they going to get their fruit? Their food, right? They're just, they got to get it from somewhere. They might get it from their own hinterlands, or they're going to have to import it. Or it's going to have to be imports. And quite often, can you advance the slide? Yeah. Quite often, the actual transportation infrastructure is better getting it from port than it is from, say, even the whole hinterland of those cities. So, 35% more income and rising incomes, doubling food production in 35 years. And some will come from increased domestic production in where these markets are, but a lot of the increase in food consumption will come from international trade, from net food exporting countries. Okay, can you? Oh, okay. So, I mean, I was hoping to have a pointer, but I don't. But I mean, if you want to look at the croplands of the earth, you can see, South Asia, China, and so forth, all, doing pretty bad. So where's the extra going to come from, I guess is my question. If we really look at this, it's not going to come from Western Europe. Some will come from the United States, as Joe has said. But there's this little patch up into Canada, particularly Western Canada, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Alberta, and so forth, and Kazakhstan, Russia, and so forth, right? So, and there's a little bit, Brazil is there, and Australia is there, and so forth, but, where is the extra going to come from? Okay. Canada is one of the major net food exporting countries in the world. Food production is much larger than domestic demand. Canadian prairies is one of the areas that can considerably expand agricultural production. And you think, well, could they? Well, if you give every farmer in Canada, grain farmer in Canada, a 40% sustained increase in production in price, just watch what would happen. But our problem in Canada, when we think about policy and so forth, is can we move it? We had a huge crop a couple of years ago, and we really struggled to move it, right? And we have a railway system that's, was built 100 and some odd years ago, and not really huge amounts of improvement since. We have bad ports, are crowded ports, and they're in the wrong place maybe, and so forth. So, thinking about policy, there is going to be this huge opportunity, I think, but whether we can capitalize on it will depend on doing some it takes a long time to improve a railway or a port or something. We've got to start thinking about it now. Next slide, please. And now let's look at where would the competition come from relative to Canada? That doesn't mean there isn't going to be any competition. Joe seemed to be quite bullish on Kazakhstan and Russia and so forth. Who would invest there? What's been going on lately? Russia just wants to keep that all unstable. I can't, yes, they can grow a little bit, but are you going to make the really big investments you need to capitalize on this, right? The U.S. still has an ambitious biofuels policy. It may scale back a little bit, but it's a constraint. The EU also has a very ambitious biofuels policy, and they choose to use biotech. They can't get the productivity growth. Brazil has got its problems, and again, got problems with moving the stuff, I think. And Australia, well, we don't know about Australia, but, it seems like climate change has really beaten up on Australia, and they have lots of droughts and so forth. So I think Canada looks pretty good, in terms of, not that the competitors won't be there, but we seem to be, to me anyway, less constrained except for our ability to move things, right? This way. All right. So, for Canada, I think probably there's going to be an export mix. We're always very interested in having value-added agricultural products, and I think given that people are getting richer, there's going to be large opportunities for value-added products. But don't discount commodity imports. Don't not invest in commodity exports. Don't not invest in commodity exports. Because nature really, if you came down to it, has designed the almost perfect tradable product in a wheat kernel and others. We need to do both. We can't be focused on just value-added stuff. The market will be there for that stuff, but we also do not need to discount the sort of just moving commodities, because that's still going to be a very important thing for Canada. So I'm almost done. So, I want to go back to the landscape for a moment. All of those numbers, except now that they might be slightly changed with China, 1/3 of all that projected growth is going to happen in India, in population. And India is getting richer, right? India is going to have to import food. They don't like to, they don't want to, but they're going to have to import food. As far as I know, we're the only country that's seriously deep into negotiating with India, where we could have better access to India than our competitors, right? So I think we could have a real edge there. So let's, at least if I had a policy advice, get that one done. Even if it's not perfect, get it done. So, you know, as India grows, the population of India grows, you know, you can get there. How am I doing? Great. No, okay. On time, I mean. Yeah, okay. Okay, anyway, I'm done pretty much. So I think next few years, Canadian trends, I think the Canadian trade policy landscape is likely to change if these things are ratified, if the treaties that we've already negotiated and so forth are ratified, and will be the most significant change since NAFTA. You know, and NAFTA was very transformative for us. I think global market forces can only mean a bright future for Canada. You know, every year things are going to go up and down, as they always do, but in the long run, and even Joe was showing those growths, it's got to be good, right? But when we think about policy, there are going to be significant infrastructure challenges and private investment challenges to be able to take advantage of the trade landscape and the market forces. Right? And one of the things that at least I see, and maybe it's because I'm one of these people that tries to do these things, I think there's a crying need for analysis. We really don't know what our market opportunities are likely to be in, say, a lot of the TPP markets. You know, we don't really know very much about where and what and which kind of products might do well in India. You know, we don't know very much about what's going to happen in China, and you know, we've not been doing very much trade analysis. And you know, I think we need to put some mechanisms back into the Canadian system to do more work to take advantage of these markets. So, thank you, and I'll take some questions.
Thank you very much.